2 weeks ago, the outcome of this war looked predictable. The United States and Israel possess some of the most advanced military forces in the world. Iran does not. On paper, the result of a direct confrontation seemed obvious. But wars are not always decided by who has the most powerful military. Sometimes they are decided by who chooses the battlefield. And over the past 48 hours, that battlefield may be changing. Reports are emerging of renewed missile strikes, incidents near major shipping lanes, and growing disruption across global energy markets. Commercial vessels have caught fire near the Strait of Hormuz. Tanker companies are reassessing routes. Oil prices are beginning to react. What initially appeared to be a contained military campaign may now be expanding into something much larger. And that shift may reveal the real strategy behind Iran's response. Because Iran cannot defeat the United States in a conventional war. Its air force is smaller, its navy is weaker, its economy has faced years of sanctions and pressure. So instead of trying to win the war outright, Iran appears to be pursuing a different objective. A strategy military analyst sometimes describes as victory denial. The logic is simple. If victory is impossible, then the goal becomes something else. Make victory impossible for your opponent as well. And this is where the story becomes more complicated. Because modern wars are rarely fought only on the battlefield. They unfold across interconnected systems, energy markets, shipping routes, regional alliances, and domestic politics. And in those arenas, the balance of power looks very different. In the early days of the conflict, American and Israeli airstrikes targeted key elements of Iran's military infrastructure. Missile launch sites, radar systems, command centers. The objective appeared clear: weaken Iran's ability to respond quickly and decisively. Iran retaliated with missiles and drones, targeting military positions and strategic facilities. At first glance, the pattern looked familiar, a cycle of strikes and counterstrikes similar to other regional confrontations. And suddenly, the conflict is no longer only about air defenses and missile systems. It is also about oil flows, trade routes, and the fragile balance that keeps global energy markets functioning. That shift matters, because when a conflict begins to affect global systems, the strategic calculations of every player involved begin to change. Governments start to weigh the economic consequences. Energy importing countries begin to worry about supply disruptions. Regional allies reassess their own security risks. And the longer these pressures build, the more complicated the war becomes. Which raises an important question. Did the planners who designed the opening phase of this conflict assume that rapid military strikes would quickly weaken Iran's ability to escalate? If so, the emerging developments suggest that assumption may now be under pressure. Because the conflict may no longer be confined to the battlefield. It may now be spreading into the global systems that surround it. And if that is the case, the next phase of this war could look very different from the first. To understand why the conflict may now be entering a new phase, we have to go back to how it began. The opening strategy from the United States and Israel appeared to follow a familiar military doctrine: rapid dominance. The idea behind rapid dominance is straightforward. Strike quickly. Target critical military infrastructure, disrupt command structures, and create enough shock in the early stages of the conflict that the opponent struggles to coordinate a sustained response. In the early days of the war, this approach seemed to be unfolding exactly as planned. Precision airstrikes targeted Iranian missile launch sites and military installations. Radar systems and air defense assets were reportedly hit. Command centers were placed under intense pressure. The expectation among many analysts was that these early blows would significantly limit Iran's ability to respond in an organized way. But that expectation rested on an important assumption. It assumed the conflict would remain primarily a military confrontation. And that assumption may now be under strain. Because Iran's response has not been limited to conventional battlefield retaliation. Instead, it appears to be spreading across multiple layers of the regional system. Missile launches and drone attacks have continued, but the pattern of escalation suggests something broader. Groups aligned with Iran across the region have increased their activity. Commercial vessels operating near sensitive maritime corridors have reported incidents. Energy markets are beginning to react. In isolation, each of these events might appear manageable, but taken together, they create a very different picture. They suggest a strategy focused less on direct battlefield victory and more on strategic pressure. And this approach has deep roots in Iran's military doctrine. For decades, Iranian planners have assumed that any direct war with a major power would place them at a technological disadvantage. Their response has been to develop a network-based strategy, one that relies on multiple pressure points rather than a single decisive battlefield. Instead of concentrating all forces in one place, the strategy spreads risk across different domains: missiles, drones, maritime activity, regional militias, economic disruption. Each element alone may not determine the outcome of the conflict, but together, they create a web of pressure that is difficult to contain. This is where geography begins to matter. The Middle East is not only a region of political tension, it is also one of the most important energy corridors in the world. Major oil exporters depend on narrow maritime passages to move energy supplies to global markets. Tanker traffic flows through these routes every day, linking the region's energy reserves to economies across Asia, Europe, and beyond. Even limited disruption in these corridors can ripple quickly through global markets. And that is exactly what traders and shipping companies are now watching. Recent reports of incidents involving commercial vessels near critical waterways have already begun affecting insurance costs and tanker routing decisions. Shipping companies, by their nature, are risk sensitive. If the perceived danger rises even slightly, routes change quickly. Those changes matter because energy markets respond not only to actual disruptions, but also to the possibility of disruption. When uncertainty increases, prices often follow, and that is one of the ways regional conflicts can begin to produce global consequences. Meanwhile, political pressure is beginning to build across several fronts. Countries that rely heavily on Middle Eastern energy supplies are monitoring developments closely. Regional governments hosting foreign military bases are assessing their own exposure. Diplomatic channels are becoming more active as governments weigh how far the escalation might go. This does not necessarily mean the war is spiraling out of control, but it does mean the conflict is becoming more complex. What began as a military confrontation may now be evolving into a multi-domain contest, one involving not only missiles and aircraft, but also economics, geography, and political alliances. And once a conflict reaches that stage, controlling its direction becomes much harder, because every new pressure point creates another variable in the strategic equation, and this is where the deeper geopolitical stakes begin to emerge. If the conflict is expanding beyond the battlefield, the next question becomes clear: how exactly does that strategy work? Because creating pressure across multiple domains is not random escalation. It follows a logic that military planners sometimes describe as cost imposition. Instead of defeating an opponent directly, the objective is to gradually increase the price of continuing the conflict. Every missile interception costs money. Every deployed aircraft requires fuel, maintenance, and logistics. Every disrupted shipping lane forces companies to change routes, raise insurance premiums, or delay cargo. None of these pressures alone ends a war, but together they begin to reshape the strategic environment in which the war is being fought. And this is where Iran's long-term planning becomes relevant. For decades, Iranian military doctrine has been built around the assumption that a direct confrontation with a technologically superior military would place Iran at a disadvantage. As a result, planners focused on building capabilities designed not for decisive battlefield victory, but for persistent disruption. Missile forces capable of reaching regional bases, drone networks that can be deployed quickly and in large numbers, naval tactics designed to operate in confined maritime spaces, and relationships with regional groups that extend Iran's reach beyond its own borders. This approach does not aim to control the battlefield in the traditional sense. Instead, it aims to make the battlefield everywhere, and that changes the nature of the conflict. Because once multiple fronts emerge, military, maritime, economic, political, the stronger power faces a difficult challenge. It must respond to all of them simultaneously. Consider the logistical side of the equation. Military operations on the scale currently being reported require enormous amounts of equipment, ammunition, and coordination. Aircraft sorties must be planned and supported. Missile defense systems must remain on constant alert. Naval forces must monitor sea lanes and escort shipping where possible. All of this places significant demands on personnel, supply chains, and budgets. Meanwhile, the political dimension of the conflict continues to evolve. Governments hosting foreign military installations must consider how exposed those bases may become if the conflict widens. Regional partners must weigh their own security concerns against their political relationships. Energy importing countries must evaluate how rising prices or shipping disruptions might affect their economies. In other words, the conflict begins to spread pressure outward. And that is exactly the dynamic that cost imposition strategies are designed to create. The longer the conflict continues, the more actors become involved, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. Financial markets begin reacting to uncertainty. Shipping companies modify routes. Energy traders adjust expectations. Diplomatic channels activate as governments attempt to prevent further escalation. None of these developments determine the outcome of the war by themselves, but they do influence the broader strategic landscape. And that landscape matters, because even the most powerful military operates within political and economic constraints. Public opinion, alliance relationships, and financial costs all influence how long a war can continue and how much escalation governments are willing to accept. Which means that while the military balance may remain heavily tilted in favor of the United States and its allies, the broader strategic contest is unfolding across a much larger stage, and that stage includes actors far beyond the immediate battlefield. Energy markets in Asia, shipping companies in Europe, regional governments balancing security and economic stability. Each of these players has its own interests and concerns. And as the conflict continues, those interests begin to shape the diplomatic and political environment surrounding the war. Which leads to the next question. If the conflict is expanding across multiple systems, what does that mean for the global economy and the stability of the region? Because the deeper consequences of this war may not be limited to military outcomes at all. They may instead emerge through the global systems that connect the Middle East to the rest of the world. Once a conflict begins to interact with global systems, its consequences rarely remain confined to the region where it started. And the Middle East sits at the center of several of the most important systems in the global economy: energy markets, maritime trade routes, financial investment flows. Even limited instability in this region can ripple outward quickly. One of the clearest examples is the reaction of global energy markets. Oil prices do not respond only to actual supply disruptions. They respond to risk. If traders begin to believe that major shipping routes could become unsafe, the price of oil often moves long before any actual shortage appears. Futures markets adjust expectations. Insurance premiums for tankers increase, and shipping companies begin evaluating alternative routes. That process may already be beginning. Reports of incidents involving commercial vessels near key maritime corridors have triggered concern across the shipping industry. Companies responsible for moving energy cargo operate on tight margins and strict risk calculations. Even a small increase in perceived danger can lead to route adjustments, and those adjustments can affect supply chains across multiple continents. For countries that rely heavily on energy imports from the Middle East, this kind of uncertainty matters enormously. Governments in Asia and Europe closely monitor developments in the region because disruptions there can quickly translate into higher energy costs at home. And higher energy costs rarely remain confined to fuel markets. They influence transportation, manufacturing, electricity generation, and ultimately consumer prices, which means the economic consequences of regional conflicts often appear thousands of kilometers away from the battlefield. Meanwhile, the political environment surrounding the war is also evolving. Regional governments that host foreign military bases must consider the potential risks of becoming targets in a wider confrontation. These countries have long relied on security partnerships with larger powers, but escalation introduces new calculations. If the conflict widens, the security guarantees that once seemed reassuring can suddenly become sources of exposure. That dilemma is particularly visible among several Gulf states, where critical energy infrastructure sits within range of potential retaliation. Oil terminals, refineries, and export facilities are vital not only for regional economies, but also for global energy supplies. Any threat to these facilities would carry consequences far beyond the region, and that possibility forces governments to balance two priorities at the same time: maintaining security partnerships, while also preventing the conflict from expanding further. Diplomatic channels are therefore becoming increasingly active. Behind the scenes, governments across the region and beyond are likely discussing containment strategies, ways to prevent localized incidents from escalating into a broader regional war. Because the risks of escalation are not purely military, they are systemic. A conflict that significantly disrupts energy flows could affect global inflation, economic growth, and political stability in countries far removed from the battlefield. That is why international attention toward this conflict is growing even among nations that are not directly involved. At the same time, domestic political pressures are beginning to emerge within the countries participating in the conflict. Wars are never fought in isolation from public opinion. Economic costs, rising fuel prices, and concerns about prolonged military engagement can influence political debates inside democratic societies. Leaders must weigh strategic objectives against the realities of domestic politics. And as those pressures build, governments often begin searching for ways to control escalation while preserving their strategic position. This is the moment when wars frequently reach their most unpredictable phase, because neither side necessarily wants to appear weak. But neither side wants the conflict to spiral beyond control either. And that tension leads directly to the most important question of all. If the conflict continues to expand across military, economic, and political systems, what are the possible paths forward? When wars reach this stage, where military operations intersect with economic pressure and political risk, predicting the outcome becomes extremely difficult. Not because the balance of power is unclear, but because the number of variables keeps growing. At the center of the conflict are two very different strategic realities. The United States and its allies possess overwhelming military capabilities. Advanced aircraft, long-range strike systems, naval power, and integrated intelligence networks give them enormous operational advantages on the battlefield. Iran, by contrast, operates with far more limited conventional resources, which means the two sides are not fighting the same kind of war. For Washington and its partners, the objective is likely to degrade Iran's military capabilities and reduce its ability to threaten regional stability. For Iran, the objective appears different. ensure that any conflict becomes complicated enough, costly enough, and politically sensitive enough that its opponents hesitate to escalate further. In other words, both sides are pursuing strategies designed to shape the future course of the war, rather than win a single decisive battle. And that creates several possible paths forward. The first scenario is controlled containment. In this outcome, both sides continue limited strikes while quietly using diplomatic channels to prevent the conflict from spreading further. Regional governments work to secure critical infrastructure and shipping routes. Markets gradually stabilize as the perception of immediate risk declines. This kind of outcome has occurred in the past. Conflicts simmer, tensions remain high, but escalation is kept within boundaries. The second scenario is regional escalation. In this case, additional actors become more directly involved. Attacks on military bases or energy infrastructure trigger wider retaliation. Shipping disruptions intensify. Insurance costs spike further, and energy markets react more sharply. At that point, the conflict begins affecting not just regional security, but the stability of global economic systems. The third scenario, and the one many analysts hope to avoid, is strategic miscalculation. History shows that wars often expand, not because either side intended them to, but because a single incident triggers a chain reaction of responses. A missile strike hits an unexpected target. A naval encounter escalates unexpectedly. An attack produces casualties that demand retaliation. Each step pushes the conflict slightly further beyond the limits originally intended. And once that momentum begins, reversing it becomes extremely difficult. This is why many governments are now watching developments so closely. Because the stakes are no longer limited to military outcomes alone. They involve the stability of energy markets, the security of global trade routes, and the political balance across one of the most strategically important regions in the world. At the moment, both sides appear to be navigating a delicate balance, escalating enough to maintain strategic pressure, but avoiding actions that could trigger uncontrollable expansion of the war. How long that balance can hold remains uncertain. What is clear is that modern conflicts rarely unfold in simple, predictable ways. They evolve through layers of strategy, economics, geography, and politics. And in this conflict, the battlefield may extend far beyond where the first missiles were launched. Because the real struggle may not be about who wins the first phase of the war. It may be about who can shape the system around the war itself.